This story is titled, I Was Called and Remnant, and When the Golden Child Was Born. My parents sent me to boarding school. And after school, I didn't want to see them. My mother was furious. Hey everyone, it's been a wild ride just thinking about putting all this down, but I figured, why not? Maybe someone out there will get it. So, here's my story. My name's Ryan, 31 male. I grew up in San Francisco, in this ridiculously massive mansion on a hill overlooking the bay. You know the type. Marble everywhere, giant chandeliers in rooms no one even used. Now, don't think I'm bragging or something, because on the outside, it probably looked like we were living the dream, but inside, it was freaking cold. Not just the house itself, but the people in it. My parents. My dad was this big-shot businessman. I'm talking tailored suits, board meetings, and a voice that could make grown men jump to attention. My mom was all about appearances. She'd throw these fancy parties where she'd act like the perfect hostess while making sure every little detail was just right. But their picture-perfect life had one crack in it. Me. From as far back as I can remember, I knew I wasn't part of their plan. My parents wanted daughters, 2 of them to be exact. That was their ideal family. Instead, they got me, a boy, and it was clear from the start that I didn't fit their vision. They didn't hide it well either. I wasn't the kid they bragged about at their parties. I was the one they tolerated, the one they saw as their mistake. It wasn't just little things either. I remember being 5 and overhearing them fight. My mom was yelling at my dad, saying she didn't sign up for this and how she was supposed to have daughters, not this. I didn't understand all the words back then, but I knew enough to realize they were talking about me. My dad tried to calm her down, saying it wasn't her fault and that they could always fix it. I didn't know what fixing it meant until a year later. When I was 6, my mom got pregnant. She was glowing, happier than I'd ever seen her. For months, the house was all about this new baby. My mom hired nutritionists, yoga instructors, and even some lady called a doula to make sure everything was perfect. When Lily was born, it was like the entire world shifted. She was their golden child, their second chance at the life they wanted. Everything became about her. I'll never forget the day they brought her home. My mom cradled Lily like she was holding the most precious thing on earth. My dad looked at her with this pride I'd never seen directed at me. I stood there in the corner, watching, and I knew I wasn't part of this family anymore. A month later, they sent me to boarding school. They told me that this school was an incredible opportunity. They said I'd get the best education, make lifelong friends, and have experiences I'd never forget. But I knew the truth. They didn't want me around. I was 10 years old, and they shipped me across the country like a package they didn't want cluttering up their house. The school was a fancy place, no doubt about it. But it wasn't a welcoming place, not for someone like me. The other kids were from old money families, politicians' kids, CEOs' kids, royalty, even. They didn't care that I came from a rich family. They could sense that my parents didn't care about me, and they used that against me. I became the kid everyone picked on. They called me the leftover or the mistake. In the dining hall, they'd laugh and say stuff like, "Don't sit with Ryan." Even his parents didn't want him. I'd laugh it off like it didn't bother me. I was being bullied, but I tried not to play the victim. But it did bother me. Every time they said it, it felt like they were digging a knife a little deeper. The worst part was how true it felt. My parents barely visited. Once a year maybe, and even then, it was just for show. They'd check my grades, lecture me about being presentable, and then leave. My mom would spend the whole visit talking about Lily. Meanwhile, I was just there. The only person who ever cared was my Uncle Mark. He was my dad's younger brother, and he couldn't have been more different. Mark worked at a factory, managing a team of workers who built engines. He didn't have the money or the prestige my parents had, but he had something they didn't: heart. Mark would visit me on weekends when no one else did. He'd take me to baseball games, get me burgers at this little diner down the road, and just sit with me, talking about life. He didn't lecture or judge, he just listened. For those few hours, I felt like I mattered. Mark was the closest thing I had to a parent. As the years went by, I learned to cope. I stopped expecting my parents to care. Instead, I threw myself into school. I wasn't the smartest kid, but I worked hard, not because I wanted to impress them, but because it gave me something to focus on. I figured if I could just make it through, I'd get out of their orbit and build my own life. By the time I graduated, I was done with them. They had their perfect family with Lily, and I wasn't part of it. So I made a plan. I applied to universities far from home, and when I got into a decent university, I jumped at the chance. My dad wired me money for tuition and expenses, probably relieved to get rid of me for good. I didn't care. I just felt like I was in control of my own future. As I boarded the plane heading to my new university, a part of me couldn't shake the weight of it all. The years of being overlooked, the feeling of never being enough. It stayed with me, no matter how far I went. Still, I told myself this was my chance to start fresh. A new city, a new life, and hopefully, a new me. What I didn't realize back then was how hard it would be to leave the past behind. My parents might not have wanted me, but their shadow was always there, lingering, reminding me of where I came from. And no matter how much distance I put between us, it always found a way back into my life. Moving to another country was like stepping into another world. Everything felt different, and thankfully, I wasn't surrounded by people who knew my family or my past. Nobody here looked at me as Ryan, the leftover, or the mistake. I could just be me, whoever that was. There was no joke. The students were insanely smart, driven, and competitive. It was intimidating at first, but I was determined to prove I belonged. I spent hours in the library, studying until my brain felt like mush. I wasn't the smartest guy in the room, but I made up for it by working harder than anyone else. That's how I met Jake. He was in one of my finance classes, this laid-back guy from Toronto with a quick wit and a knack for making everything seem less intense. He wasn't from old money or anything, but he had big dreams. He wanted to break into the financial world, build something from the ground up, and he wasn't shy about saying it. We started hanging out after class, eating cheap takeout, and sharing big plans. Jake had this knack for spotting opportunities, making me believe I could break free from my family's shadow. Then there was Claire, sharp, ambitious, and no nonsense. From a modest background, she'd fought her way to this university and made it clear she was there to win, not to play by old money rules. The three of us started to sit in the common room late at night, tossing around ideas about what we wanted to do after graduation. Jake wanted to start a brokerage firm, something fresh and innovative. Claire was skeptical at first. She was more cautious, more about stability, but eventually she warmed up to the idea. And me? I wanted it. It felt like the kind of bold move that could finally put my past behind me. By the time we graduated, we had a plan. We rented a tiny office in New York. It wasn't much, just a couple of old desks, secondhand chairs, and 3 laptops we'd barely managed to afford, but it was ours. Starting out was brutal. The financial world doesn't roll out the red carpet for newcomers, especially ones without big names or established reputations. Some days, we'd go home with nothing to show for it. Other days, we'd land a small client and feel like we just won the lottery. The thing about Jake and Claire, though, was that they never let me feel like we were failing. Jake had this way of brushing off rejection, turning every no into fuel to keep going. Claire kept us grounded, making sure we didn't get carried away with the highs or crushed by the lows. We were a team, and for the first time, I felt like I was part of something real. After a year of hustling, the firm started to gain traction. We didn't have the flashy offices or the big-name clients, but we had something a lot of firms didn't: genuine relationships with the people we worked with. Through all this, my past wasn't as far behind me as I'd hoped. My parents still had a way of creeping into my life, no matter how much distance I tried to put between us. It started with the occasional messages, updates about Lily's latest achievements. At first, I ignored the messages, but they kept coming. It wasn't just updates. It was like they were trying to remind me of my place in the family, or lack of one. They didn't care about what I was doing, or the life I was building. To them, I was still the mistake they shipped off to boarding school. One day, I made the mistake of opening one of those messages. My mom had attached a photo from a recent family event. There was Lily, standing between my parents, all smiles in her perfect designer dress. My mom had captioned it, "Our pride and joy." That was it. No mention of me, no sign that I even existed. It stung more than I wanted to admit. I showed the email to Jake and Claire, hoping they'd laugh it off with me. But Claire just shook her head. "They don't deserve you," she said. And for some reason, those words hit harder than any insult my parents ever threw my way. I tried to focus on the firm, but life has a way of reminding you that the past doesn't just disappear. It creeps back in when you least expect it. I was sitting at my desk in our tiny office when a call came. It was from one of Uncle Mark's co-workers at the factory. He told me Mark had collapsed on the job and was taken to the hospital. I froze. Mark was the one constant in my life, the only person who ever treated me like I mattered. I tried to call the hospital immediately, but by the time I got through to someone, it was already too late. Mark was gone. The news hit me hard. Mark had been my rock during some of the worst years of my life. He wasn't flashy or wealthy, but he was kind. He showed up when no one else did, and for a kid who'd been cast aside, that meant everything. I booked the first flight to his place, barely able to process what had happened. The funeral was small, just a handful of his coworkers and neighbors. My parents didn't come, of course. They hadn't spoken to Mark in years, and I'm sure they didn't even notice he was gone. As I stood there at the service, I felt this overwhelming mix of guilt and anger. Guilt that I hadn't visited him more often, that I hadn't called more. Anger at how unfair it all was. How someone like Mark could just disappear while my parents carried on in their perfect, hollow lives. After the funeral, I met with Mark's lawyer to go over his will. I wasn't expecting much since lived a simple life in a modest apartment, but what I didn't expect was for him to leave everything to me. His savings, his apartment, and a few personal things, like an old baseball glove we used to play catch with, and a stack of handwritten notes he'd kept from my time at boarding school. It wasn't about the money or the stuff. It was about the gesture. Mark saw me as family. He thought of me as someone worth leaving a legacy to. For someone who grew up feeling like they didn't belong anywhere, that meant more than I could put into words. But of course, my parents found a way to ruin even that. A couple of weeks later, I got a letter from their lawyer. They were contesting the will. They were claiming Mark had been mentally unfit when he wrote the will, and that the assets should go to them as his closest relatives. I couldn't believe it. My parents had barely acknowledged Mark's existence when he was alive. Now they wanted to swoop in and take what little he'd left me? I was furious. This wasn't about the money. Mark's estate wasn't worth much in the grand scheme of things. This was about them trying to control me, to take away the one piece of family I had left. They'd already pushed me out of their lives, treated me like I didn't exist, and now they wanted to strip away the last bit of connection I had to someone who truly cared about me. I didn't waste any time. I hired a lawyer using some of the savings we'd scraped together from the firm. Jake and Claire backed me up without hesitation. "We'll figure it out," Jake said. "You're not fighting this alone." I really appreciated their help. I felt like I finally had people in my corner, people who actually gave a damn about what happened to me. The legal battle was brutal. My parents' lawyers were ruthless. They tried to paint me as some manipulative, ungrateful kid who'd taken advantage of a sick man. They dug up everything they could to discredit me, even going so far as to claim I wasn't emotionally stable enough to manage an inheritance. It was exhausting, both mentally and emotionally. Every time I walked into the courtroom, I felt like I was reliving all the years of rejection and dismissal I'd endured growing up. But I wasn't alone this time. Claire helped me organize documents and go through witness lists late into the night, while Jake used his network to connect us with people who could speak to Mark's character and how close we were. Together, we built a case that showed the truth that Mark loved me like a son, and that his decision to leave me everything was his, and his alone. After months of back and forth in court, the judge finally ruled in my favor. Mark's will was upheld, and my parents' case was dismissed. I just felt empty. Winning didn't bring Mark back. It didn't erase the pain of losing him, or the bitterness of having to fight for something that should have been simple. The worst part was seeing my parents in the courtroom. My mom sat there, stone-faced, not even pretending to care about the truth. For her, this wasn't about Mark or his estate. It was about punishing me for stepping out of line. My dad barely said a word the entire time. He just looked tired, like he was going through the motions because my mom told him to. When the trial ended, my mom walked past me without a word, and my dad paused for a moment, like he wanted to say something, but then he followed her out the door. That was the last time I saw them in person. After the case, I sold Mark's apartment, keeping only a few personal items that reminded me of him. The money went into the firm, giving us a much-needed boost to grow the business. But no amount of work could fill the hole he'd left behind. Mark had been the only real family I'd ever had, and now he was gone. I told myself I could finally leave my parents behind, that winning the case meant I didn't have to think about them anymore. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. My mom didn't take losing well, and I had a feeling she wasn't done with me yet. My mom wasn't the kind of person to let something go, especially when it came to what she saw as her image. Losing the case wasn't just a loss to her, it was a public embarrassment, and she was determined to make me pay for it. For a while, things seemed normal. Well, as normal as my life ever got. The firm was finally hitting its stride. With the money from Uncle Mark's estate, we upgraded our office, hired a few analysts, and started pitching to bigger clients. It felt good, like we were finally being taken seriously. Jake was busy charming every potential investor we met. Claire was keeping the business running smoothly, and I was building relationships with the clients we already had. I was stepping out of my parents' shadow and creating something real. Then, out of nowhere, the SEC came knocking. I was at the office when the email hit my inbox. It was from a compliance officer saying we were under investigation for insider trading. I was totally confused. Insider trading? It didn't make any sense. We'd been meticulous about compliance, going above and beyond to make sure everything was above board. We weren't reckless, and we definitely weren't criminals. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe there'd been a mix-up, or someone had filed a false report. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear this wasn't random. The SEC had received an anonymous tip claiming the firm had traded on confidential information from one of our clients, a tech company we'd been working with for months. The timing was suspicious. Too suspicious. My first thought was, this has my mom written all over it. She wasn't one to get her hands dirty, but she had the connections to make things happen. She'd spent decades building relationships with powerful people, and I had no doubt she'd use those connections to make this investigation happen. It was her way of hitting me where it hurt. My business, my livelihood, my future. The investigation was brutal. The SEC dug into every aspect of the firm's operations, demanding records, emails, and account statements. It wasn't just about proving we hadn't done anything wrong. It was about staying afloat while our reputation took hit after hit. Some of our smaller clients got spooked and pulled their accounts. Others hesitated to invest more money with us, waiting to see how things played out. Every day felt like a new crisis. It didn't stop there. A few weeks into the investigation, my dad's company announced they were launching a boutique brokerage firm. And of course, it wasn't a coincidence. They positioned their new firm as the clean, trustworthy alternative to our firm, offering lower fees and a team of seasoned professionals. It was a calculated move, designed to siphon off our clients and crush us while we were vulnerable. I was furious, but I wasn't surprised. This was my classic mom. She wasn't just trying to win, she was trying to destroy me. It wasn't enough for her to take Uncle Mark's inheritance from me. She wanted to prove that I was nothing without her. Jake and Claire were just as angry as I was. Claire, ever the planner, started working with our legal team to fight the SEC investigation head-on. Jake, on the other hand, had a different idea. "We need to pivot," he said one night, pacing around the office. "If we keep playing by their rules, they'll crush us. We have to find a way to stay ahead." Jake's idea was bold, risky even, but it made sense. So, instead of trying to compete directly with my dad's firm, we'd shift our focus to a niche market they couldn't touch: cryptocurrency and fintech. It was a new frontier in finance, full of volatility and uncertainty, but also huge potential for growth. Traditional firms like my dad's wouldn't touch it because of the regulatory risks, but we didn't have the luxury of playing it safe. At first, Claire wasn't sold. She'd always been the cautious one, the voice of reason in our trio. "Crypto's a gamble," she said. "If it crashes, we'll crash with it." But Jake and I knew we didn't have a choice. If we stuck to traditional investments, my dad's firm would steamroll us. Pivoting to crypto was our only way out. We went all in. We rebranded the firm as a forward-thinking firm, specializing in high-risk, high-reward assets. We started targeting tech entrepreneurs, startup founders, and crypto investors, people who didn't care about traditional rules or reputations. It was a gamble, but it paid off faster than we expected. One of Jake's connections introduced us to a young tech millionaire who'd made his fortune in the crypto market. He was exactly the kind of client we needed: loaded, driven, and itching to work with a firm that got the chaotic world of digital assets without needing a PowerPoint to explain it. Landing him as a client gave us credibility in the crypto space, and soon other investors started coming to us. The shift wasn't exactly smooth sailing. The crypto market was wild, and the rules seemed to change every other day. We had to tread carefully, juggling big ideas with keeping everything legit. But it paid off. Within 6 months, we'd not only bounced back, but leveled up. We weren't just hanging in there. We were crushing it in a space Mercer Financial couldn't even dream of touching. Meanwhile, the SEC investigation dragged on. It was exhausting, knowing we were being scrutinized for something we hadn't done, but we refused to back down. Claire worked tirelessly with our lawyers to prove our innocence, combing through every piece of evidence to show the allegations were baseless. Jake kept the business running, keeping clients reassured and investors confident. Finally, after months of back and forth, the SEC cleared us of all charges. There was no evidence of insider trading because it had never happened. The whole thing had been a setup, just like we suspected. But by the time the investigation ended, we'd already moved on. My mom must have been livid. She threw everything she had at me: lawsuits, shady sabotage, even dragging my dad's company into her drama. But it still wasn't enough. We didn't just beat her at her own game. We flipped the script and made up our own rules. I thought I finally stepped out of her shadow. But even as I celebrated our victory, I knew this wasn't the end. My mom didn't give up easily, and I had a feeling she wasn't done with me yet. And the scars were still there. Every time I looked at the list of clients we'd lost during the investigation, I felt a mix of anger and regret. My parents had done everything they could to destroy me, and for a while it had worked. They'd thrown doubt on everything I'd built, and some people believed their lies. But the thing about people like my mom is that they don't know when to quit. A few weeks after the SEC cleared us, I started hearing whispers in the industry. My dad's firm was struggling. Their boutique brokerage had flopped, unable to compete with ours in the crypto space. Their attempts to undercut us with lower fees had backfired, leaving them with razor-thin margins. And now they were quietly trying to pivot, mimicking our firm's business model to stay afloat. I should have felt satisfied, even vindicated, but all I felt was exhaustion. My parents weren't just a problem to be solved. They were a force of nature. No matter how many battles I won, they always came back with something new. It was like playing a never-ending game of chess against an opponent who didn't care about the rules. But here's the thing. I wasn't the same person I'd been when this all started. I wasn't the scared kid at that school I got bullied at, trying to laugh off the insults that cut too deep. I wasn't the aimless college student desperate to prove himself. I was someone who had built something real, alongside people who believed in me. And this time, I wasn't going to let my parents drag me back into their toxic world. Our firm continued to grow. We landed a partnership with a major fintech company, bringing in millions in new business. Jake was in talks to open a second office in Los Angeles, while Claire was leading negotiations with a European investment fund that could expand our reach internationally. The success wasn't just about the money. It was about proving to myself that I didn't need the Mercer name to matter. Our crypto millionaire client even helped us get invited to some of the most exclusive tech and finance events. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, walking into spaces my parents would have killed to be a part of, not as their son, but as someone they couldn't take credit for. But even with all the success, my parents weren't done. My mom started sending messages again. At first, they were disguised as olive branches. Family updates, she called them. Pictures of my sister Lily, announcements about my dad's company, invitations to Mercer family events. I ignored them all. Then the tone shifted. Her texts were the classic passive-aggressive, sprinkled with jabs about how I'd torn the family apart, or how my choices had forced them to compete with me. She even tried to guilt-trip me about hurting Lily because I wouldn't come back home. Typical. Manipulative. Calculated. And completely missing any hint of self-awareness. I ignored her. There was no point in responding. Then, out of nowhere, my dad called. The man never reached out unless he needed something, so I didn't bother picking up. But he left a voicemail. And yeah, I caved and listened. His voice sounded tired, almost desperate. He wanted me to call back. Against my better judgment, I did. What followed was peak awkwardness. Dad wasn't apologizing or trying to patch things up. He wanted help. His firm was circling the drain. Their boutique brokerage experiment had drained their resources, and their main business was bleeding clients to younger, more innovative firms. He wanted me to come home, merge our firm with their company, and save the family legacy. Seriously? After everything they'd pulled, dragging me to court over Mark's will, sabotaging my company, trashing my name, they expected me to swoop in and save them? I calmly told him no and hung up before he could argue. A week later, my mom called. Calm? Nope. This wasn't about pretending to make peace. She was furious, firing off accusations about how I was selfish and ungrateful, even throwing in traitor for good measure. She ranted until she was out of steam. Then I just said, "You made this bed, not me," and hung up. That was the last time I heard from either of them. With my parents out of the picture, I turned my focus to the life I was building. My company is thriving. Jake and Claire were like family. And weirdly enough, I found myself grateful for the lessons my parents had taught me, even if they weren't the ones they intended. They showed me exactly who I didn't want to be. Lately, I got a package. It was from Uncle Mark's old apartment, something I must have missed when I cleared it out. Inside was a framed photo of us at a baseball game and a note he'd written years ago. It just said, "Proud of you, kid." That photo's on my desk now, a daily reminder of where I started and how far I've come. Mark believed in me when no one else did, and I like to think he's still rooting for me. My parents? They're still out there, stuck in their bubble of wealth and fake smiles. But they don't have any power over me anymore. I've built something real, something they'll never get and can't take away. Anyway, if you made it this far, thanks for reading. Let me know your thoughts in the comments.